Hello again, Biology 300 students. I'm Mr. Parker coming at you with the Ecology Screencast session number 4. And in this one, we're looking at energy and how it flows through the ecosystem. We've looked at all the different aspects of the ecosystem now, and we've talked about energy in the previous one. We're just kind of building upon that and looking at food chains and food webs more specifically. Okay, so moving a little bit forward from here, we're going to take a look at I had mentioned this in the previous screencast, but that I talked about nutrients are always recycled through an ecosystem. Basically, the chemicals and molecules are returned to the soil by the decomposers, and energy is always flowing through the ecosystem from one organism to the next. Initially, the ultimate source of the sun, or ultimate source of energy, is the sun. The producers use this and convert that sunlight energy into chemical energy. And eventually they're able to transfer that energy to other organisms through the process of the food chain and food webs that we'll talk about. Okay, so energy, again, you need to know it always flows through an ecosystem. Nutrients are always recycled in an ecosystem. All right, so the idea of food chains. I had mentioned it earlier in the screencast, but a food chain shows the flow of energy from one organism to another, okay, through these different trophic levels, going from your producers to consumers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on. The energy flow is always represented by the arrow. Okay, so whatever direction the energy is flowing, we're always putting the arrow in that direction. Okay, so make sure if it's going up, going down, going sideways, however it's doing, make sure you're putting the energy is pointing to the organism that actually is consuming, not the one that's being consumed. So, for example, okay, if we look at this particular food chain that we looked at prior to in the last screencast, you can see here we have our producers, okay, our plant and our phytoplankton. Notice here you can see the arrows, okay, are moving in the direction that energy is flowing. We have our first trophic level here, our second, third, and so on and so forth as we go through this. And again, notice the direction of the arrows pointing the flow of the energy. It's going up in this particular case from our producers that get the initial energy from the sunlight, and then they convert it into the chemical energy that it needs to do its normal processes through its life. All right. So that is the food chains. Okay. Now looking at another characteristic, it's called food webs. All right. And what we're doing here with the food web, basically what it is, it's a representation of all the interconnected food chains within this ecosystem. So what we've done is we've taken one food chain, okay, and now we have multiple food chains within this ecosystem, and there's a connection between all of them. Okay, these food webs show multiple feeding relationships. Organisms could be part of one food chain, part of different food webs. Okay, so they could have multiple arrows pointing to them. And to give you an example of that, you can see here, okay, this is our food web. And notice, again, here we have on the bottom, okay, these are our producers, okay, and you have some producers in the water, your phytoplankton, all right, and then you can work your way up. Notice the arrows could be pointing to many different organisms, as you can see here, okay, and again, this particular grasshopper, which is a primary consumer, is being consumed by multiple organisms, and then they're part of multiple food chains and part of multiple food webs, and how they're all interconnected. Okay, so and then you can see in the bottom here your decomposers and your detritivores, which help return all the nutrients back to the soil, and so it's being recycled through this process. Okay, so this is a food chain. A food chain is just showing one. Like in this particular case, you could say a food chain would be these plants connected to the grasshopper. Okay, connected to the mouse, and then connected to the owl. That would be one food chain. Okay, but then there's multiple food chains in here, so that when you connect all of them together, we refer to that as your food web. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is kind of show you a little video that's going to talk about both these concepts, food webs and food chains, and then I'll come back and kind of start, talk a little bit what we call energy pyramids.
In every ecosystem, there are two different types of organisms, producers and consumers. The producers, or autotrophs, can produce their own food. These are photosynthesizing organisms like plants and some microorganisms. Consumers are called heterotrophs. There are different types of consumers. Herbivores that only eat plants are classified as primary consumers, and carnivores are called secondary consumers because they live off the primary consumers. Fungi and bacteria that eat dead and decaying organisms are called decomposers, but they also are consumers. They are very important in the food web because they break down dead matter like grass, tree trunks, and the remains of animals so that nutrients are returned to the soil. Within an ecosystem, all of the producers, consumers, secondary consumers, and decomposers make up an interdependent community. One of the ways that they interrelate is through the food web. The food web within an ecosystem is actually made up of many overlapping food chains of predators and prey. For example, on the African plain, grass grows in abundance. A herbivore, such as an antelope, eats the grass. A carnivore, like a lion, kills and devours the antelope. Jackals eat the remains. Worms, ants, and bacteria consume what is left, and someday will feed on the lions and jackals when they die. Since most species eat and are eaten by more than one other species, these food chains link together into a food web. Consequently, changes affecting one group ultimately can impact on several others. Food chains exist in all ecosystems.
All right, welcome back. And hopefully that video had given you a little bit more of an insight into food webs and food chains, and talked a little bit more about decomposers and some of the other producers and consumers that are found within the ecosystem. Okay, so like I had promised before the video, I was going to move into ecological pyramids. Okay, and kind of defining basically, ecologists use ecological pyramids to represent the relationship among trophic levels. Okay, so remember, we start off at the bottom as the first trophic level, then you move up to the second and third. And what they're going to do is, there's basically three areas that these ecologists look at. They look at pyramids of numbers, energy, and biomass. Okay, and looking at the relationship on how much energy is available from the first trophic level to the second, how much biomass, meaning living material, is available from the first to second to third, and also in the numbers. Okay, so make sure you jot down the three different types of pyramids. We'll visit each one here in a second and go through those. So the first one you see here is the pyramid of energy. Okay, and again, what this does is shows the total amount of energy that's available in each trophic level. All right, and what it's referred to is the 10% rule. And what this predicts is that only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is available to the next. So if we're talking about the first trophic level, we're going to lose 90% of the energy when it moves into the second trophic level, the amount of energy. All right, so let's go ahead and show you a little visual of that. So what you will notice here, okay, so originally from the lights, okay, you can see energy is measured in this case in joules. You have 1 million joules of energy coming from the sunlight. And then the plant, what they're going to do is they're going to lose 90% of that energy, so there's only 10% available for the plant. And then when that grasshopper comes and consumes the plant, okay, the grasshopper only has 10% of that energy available, so it's lost another 90% from the plant. And then so every step, every trophic level we move up, we're losing 90% of the energy, and there's only 10% available from the previous one. Okay, so this snake here, you know, is only getting 90% or getting 10% of the energy that the secondary consumer had available at the time. Okay, so that's your pyramid of energy. Now, a pyramid of biomass kind of has the same idea, the 10% rule. What this does and what it looks at is the total amount of living tissue that is available at each of the trophic levels. Okay, so I'll give you a representation of that again. All right, so here you can see in the bottom, we're looking at the biomass amount of living material, the grams per meter squared. Initially, we start off at 10,000 of those. Okay, and then again, what happens is every trophic level you go up, you're losing about 90% of the mass that's available at each trophic level. And if you start thinking about it, that makes sense because every trophic level you go up, there's less energy available, so there's less, living organisms at the time at those different trophic levels as you move up, which means there's going to be less living material. Okay, and this goes right along with the idea that the last pyramid, which is the pyramid of numbers. Okay, and this shows the total number of organisms that are found within each trophic level. So this kind of goes, again, right along with the ideas of the amount of energy and the amount of biomass. As you move up trophic levels, okay, every time you go up a trophic level, there's 10% amount of organisms that are available at the particular time of the original trophic level. So when you go from weeds to tadpoles, we're losing about 90% of the numbers. And so if you think about, in your yard, you have all that blades of grass, okay, and then the amount of consumers that are able to consume that grass drops about 90%, okay? And again, you got to think about it. There's a lot less energy available for the pike in the beginning. And, when we talk about the pyramid of energy, okay, a lot less energy, so there's going to be less living material and there's less organisms because there's not as much, it's not as much available energy, so it can only support so much life. Okay, so we have our three different pyramids. It's pyramids of energy, biomass, and numbers. All right, I'm going to give you one more little quick video on this idea, and then we'll move on, kind of wrap things up from here.
In every food chain, as the materials needed to sustain life pass from producers to consumers, usable chemical energy is gradually lost to the environment in the form of heat. Ecologists depict the flow of energy through a food chain by using a diagram like this one called a pyramid of energy. In such a diagram, the producers form the base, next are the first-order consumers, followed by the second-order consumers, with the third-order consumers at the top. One scientific study of energy flow concluded that only 16% of the energy from food producers is passed on to the first-order consumers that eat them. After that, only 11% of the energy stored in the bodies of the first-order consumers is passed on to the second-order consumers. When third-order consumers eat the second-order consumers, only 5% of the available energy is passed on. To make this easier to understand, ecologists use a pyramid of numbers based on the number of organisms needed to make a simple food chain. For example, one study showed that it took 175 food-producing plants to support 40 first-order consumers like caterpillars. 40 first-order consumers were needed to support 5 second-order consumers, such as the lizards that eat caterpillars. They in turn supported just 1 third-order consumer, such as a lizard-eating bird. This pyramid clearly demonstrates how in a food chain, large populations of certain organisms are needed to support very small populations of other organisms.
Alright, so again, hopefully that video had enhanced your knowledge on the flow of energy and how it moves through the ecological pyramids. This is wrapping up Screencast session number 4, dealing with ecological pyramids, numbers, biomass, food webs, and food chains. And in class, we're going to do a couple different things dealing with this activity really for the next couple weeks that will help reiterate this and reinforce some of the major concepts that we talk about.
So you were 6 feet under.